Alright, let's now check out how to download and install VCV Rack. So I'm at vcvrack.com, and right on the front page here you can see the 3 different downloads for the 3 different operating systems. One for macOS, one for Windows, and one for Linux. I'm on a Mac platform here, so I'm going to click on macOS. It downloads pretty instantaneously because it's a very small file. I'm going to open up the .dmg file. And inside here, we have this rack application file that we can just transfer to the applications folder. I already have this pre-existing in my applications folder, but I'll just replace it so I get the most recent version. Now there's also this .component.vst and this bridge-effects.vst files. The component is the AU plugin, which we can drop into the components folder. I'll replace what I already have here. Same for the bridge effects and the regular bridge. Now don't worry too much about these. The main application is the rack, the standalone application. So as long as you drag that into your applications folder, that is if you're on a Mac operating system, on a PC or Windows platform and Linux platform, the process will be slightly different. But once you have that in your applications folder, as I have here, I can just double click. It's going to give me a warning saying that it's downloaded from the internet. I'm going to open it anyway. And it should look like this. So this is the VCV rack. It's completely blank. There are no modules loaded in. So this gives us a good starting point to work with. All right, in the next tutorial, we're going to look at the interface of this application and get to know it a bit better. So let's explore the interface for VCV Rack. As you can see, it's quite minimal. This is our main interface where we will add all the individual modules and piece them together to create sounds. Up top here, we have a very basic file menu option. So standard things like creating a new patch, opening existing patches. Like for example, I can open up this patch here. Saving patches or doing a save as. So pretty straightforward commands over here. You can explore these on your own. Cable opacity can be helpful if you want to make the cables a bit less visible or extremely obvious. Cable tension, the slack on the cable, and also zooming. Okay, let's start from scratch. I'm going to click on new patch here. I'll say sure, clear the patch and start over. Now, how do we add modules? I'm going to right click here, and now we get this window. We can choose from the different authors, or we can choose from the different tags. So for example, if I want to access modules from the basic VCV rack installation, I'll click on fundamental. And here are some of the basic modules that we can work with. Let's load in the VCO1 here. So you just have to click and drag, or just click on it once and the module will be loaded in. You can drag the module around on the row. You can drag it to a different row, completely up to you. Let's add in another one, right click. Again, let's go into fundamental. Actually, let's go back, and instead of accessing things via the authors, you can access different module based on tags. So for example, if I'm looking for an LFO, I'll click on LFO here. And now we're looking at all the different LFOs. And let's say I want to load LFO2 here. So I'll just click once. And we have our LFO loaded in. To delete a module, you can right click and select delete over here. While we're in this right click menu, let's look at some of these other options. There's save preset, load preset, paste preset, copy preset, and duplicate, all relating to just the selected module. Disconnect cables, so if there were cables connected just to this module, you can disconnect all of them. There's also a master disconnect cable here, so that'll disconnect all cables in a patch. So for example, if I have a patch set up with multiple cables connected, I can choose disconnect cables here, and then say remove all patch cables. I'll hit OK, and it's all gone. Going back to that right click menu, so we looked at disconnect cables. Randomize is helpful. So if I select randomize, it's going to randomize all the parameters just on that particular module. And then finally, there's initialize to reset everything back to its default state. Let's now talk about the add-on plugins that you have access to with VCV Rack. So you can see over here in the top bar, we have manage plugins, update plugins, and log out. So essentially, you can access additional plugins if you are logged into your account. So if I click on manage plugins here, we go to this page on our web browser and we have access to all these different plugins. Now we need to register or log into an account to have access to these. So I'm going to just log into my account here. And now once I'm in, I can see all the plugins that I have downloaded, the red ones, and all the blue ones are the ones that I can download, and they're all completely free, as you can see. There are a few of these green ones which you need to pay for, but aside from those, mostly the add-on plugins are free. So let's try accessing one of these. So let's just pick this very first one, 21 kilohertz by Jake Hurin. So I'll hit that free button here, and now it's part of my account. Going back in here, let's click on Update Plugins. And it's so download that particular plugin. It says all plugins have been updated. Close rack and relaunch it to load new updates. So I'm going to do that. It actually quits on its own. Let's open it up. And now when I right click, we should have access to that one plugin. So what was the name of the company? 21 kilohertz. And we have these 3 different modules here. So we can access that. Second one, as well as the third one here. Cool. Now in this course, we're going to stick with the main fundamental modules. So when you right click, there's a fundamental category here. We're going to stick with these modules. And we're obviously going to use some of the core modules which are required to just get some sound and MIDI going in. But once you get a good understanding of all the fundamental modules, feel free to explore all these third-party ones. There's a lot of fun modules that are available out there, and it's pretty amazing how a lot of them are completely free. In order to get sound going on VCV Rack, we need to have access to a specific module. So let's see how we can access that and set it up so everything works properly. I'm going to right-click on this blank patch here and go into the core category. And in here, we have this first module, the audio module. So I have loaded that in. I can place this wherever I want. I don't have anything else here, so it doesn't really matter. You can see here, this is the main audio driver that's being used. I'm on a Mac platform, so it's using Core Audio. On a PC or Linux platform, it might look different. This over here selects the device that you want to use to output the audio. So I have a bunch of different devices plugged in, but I want to use my Apogee Duet. So I'm going to select that. And that's pretty much it. You can change up the sample rate, you can change up the block size or the buffer size. So this will affect your overall CPU usage. Generally, you want to find a nice middle ground. If you notice your CPU usage is spiking, you can increase this block size. All right, so let's test out our audio. I'm going to right click and load in a basic oscillator. We can even search over here. I'll type in VCO, which stands for Voltage Controlled Oscillator. And under the fundamental category, we have VCO1 here. I'm going to load that in. All right, so now I'm going to take an output, let's say the sine wave output, and plug that into the input on my audio interface. Now, before you do this, you want to make sure that the volume on your computer or audio interface is set to low, because we won't have any control for it directly over here. All right, so I'm going to take the sine output and plug that into the left input here. And now I'm getting sound out of the left speaker on my system. Let's say if I want that same signal to go to my right speaker as well, I can hold down the command, click and drag from that same output and plug it into the second input here. And now we have the same sound going out both speakers. All right, so that's how you can set up your audio interface with VCV Rack. All right, let's talk about making connections. So for example, if I want to make a connection from this square wave output of this VCO to anywhere else, I'm just going to click right over there. And now you see this virtual patch cable that's attached to the mouse. I can now drop it wherever I want to. Now, not exactly wherever I want to. As you can see, I can't drop it here, I can't drop it here, because these connections don't make sense. This is an output and this is also an output. So it doesn't make sense to connect an output to an output. So you can't really make a bad connection here in VCV Rack, unlike in a real Eurorack system. So if I want to take the square wave output here and plug it into the input on this filter, I'll just drop it there, let go of the mouse, and now this connection is made. To disconnect a connection, just click on an existing cable and then just drop it anywhere outside and it gets disconnected. Now you can make multiple connections from one particular output. So for example, this square wave output, I'll plug it in here on the input on the VCF, the filter. But let's say I want to take that same square wave output and I want to plug it to, let's say, the low pass filter input. Actually, no, that's the output. So let's say, let's look for maybe the VCA's input over here. So I'm going to hold down Command on my Mac, and then now I can drag another cable out and drop it into the input over here. So this is something you can't do in the Eurorack world unless you have very specific kind of cables. But in this software interface, you can make as many connections like this as you want to. All right, so that's some basics about how to use the software, the interface. Let's now get into actually making some noise. Now let's create a very basic patch. Don't worry about the individual modules that I'm going to be adding in over here. We will check them out in greater detail in future tutorials. For now, let's just get some basic sound going. All right, so I'm going to right click on this blank area, and under the fundamental category, I'm going to load in a VCO. So this stands for voltage controlled oscillator. This is going to be our sound source. Let's go ahead and add in a few more modules. I'm going to right click here. I'm looking for a voltage controlled amplifier, VCA. So I can just type it in here. And under the fundamental category, let's load in VCA1. All right, let's drag that right next to the VCO. Now we need our audio module. So I'm going to right click, and under the core module, click on audio. So we have the audio module. We also need a MIDI module. So right click and go into the core module again. We have a bunch of different MIDI modules. For now, let's just work with MIDI 1. Load that in. All right, good. So just between these 4 modules, we're going to create a basic patch. All right, let's first engage our audio module. So I leave that at core audio since I'm on a Mac. In my device here, I'll select the Apogee Duet. That's what I'm using. For my MIDI device, I'm going to leave this as core MIDI. That's what a Mac interface uses. In my input category here, or in the device category here, I'm going to choose the complete control. That's what I have plugged in to my computer right now. So my MIDI device is set up, my audio device is set up. Let's start patching. So I'm going to take a sawtooth output from the VCO and plug that into the input on the VCA. Next, I'm going to take the output of the VCA, which is this jack over here, and plug it into the input on the audio interface. Now, like I said before, we don't have volume control yet for this patch, so this might be loud, so make sure you bring the volume down before making this connection. So now we hear that sawtooth on the left channel. I'll hold down Command and take another cable from the same output and plug that to the second input. All right. Now we want control over this with our MIDI device. So I'm going to take the gate output here and plug that into the CV in here. And you notice now immediately the sound has stopped. So when I play on my MIDI controller, we hear the sound. But I don't have pitch control. I'm playing different notes on my keyboard, but the pitch that we're hearing is exactly the same. So let's take the CV output from our MIDI device and plug that into the 1 volt per octave input on the VCO. So this will basically give us pitch control. So now when I play on my keyboard, so there we go, a very basic patch set up and good to go. Let's save this. I'm going to call this basic patch. I already have one, so I'm just going to replace that. And there we have it. We have set up a basic patch and we're getting sound from VCV rack. All right, in the next tutorial, we're going to dive deeper into the VCO and look at all the different controls and understand it better. All right, let's now take a detailed look at the voltage controlled oscillator section. So we still have the same patch. I'm just going to organize things a little bit here. I'm going to move these modules to the left. I'm also going to add in a couple of new modules. So right click. One is under the fundamental category. It's called scope. So we will use this to visualize the waveform that's coming out of the oscillator. And I'm going to add another module, which is going to be a spectrum analyzer. I'll just type it in here. This is a third-party plugin. Now you can download this from the VCV Rack website, or you can just skip that and just watch what I'm doing over here. Neither of these modules produce any sound. I'm just using it to visualize things, so it just helps me explain things a bit better. Alright, so let's talk about our sound over here. The oscillator over here is set to a sawtooth. I'm going to switch it to a sine wave, and that's going into the VCA, and the output of the VCA is going into this audio module that's outputting to our audio interface. I'm going to hold down Command on my Mac here and take another patch cable and plug it into this X input on this oscilloscope. And one more patch cable I'm going to connect to this input on the spectrum analyzer. Alright, now let's talk about the voltage controlled oscillator. An oscillator is the voice of the synthesizer, the thing that vibrates to produce a particular tone. In order to produce any kind of sound, vibration has to occur. Right now, this oscillator is outputting a sine wave that is going into the amplifier. So when I play notes on my keyboard, you will see on the scope, we're plotting a sine wave shape. That's why this is called a sine wave oscillator. Another important thing to notice is that in the analyzer, we can see this one lonely peak, which represents that particular frequency of the note that I'm playing. So the sine wave, if I play a middle C, you can see that frequency is somewhere approximately around 260 Hz. When I play this note G, it's somewhere approximately around 100 Hz. So that's how you measure frequency in Hertz. And our spectrum analyzer also helps us visualize that. Alright, now let's try switching over to a triangle shape. I'm going to play that same G note, which is approximately around 100 Hz. So you notice in the spectrum analyzer, we still get that same peak, but there are other peaks over here. Also looking at the scope, we notice that now it no longer has a sine shape, it has a triangle shape. So think of this as another voice. So our sine shape was a very pure waveform. It has just that one lonely peak, whereas the triangle has multiple peaks. These, by the way, are called harmonics. So this is the note that I'm playing, or also known as the fundamental frequency, and these are the other harmonics in the sound. So a triangle shape is a much more rich sound compared to a sine wave, right? Because the sine wave just has that fundamental frequency and nothing else, whereas a triangle shape has a bunch of harmonics. Alright, let's switch over to the square. Now you notice it's much louder, but at the same time, the harmonics are a lot louder as well. And of course, the scope also shows us that it looks different. You can see it has that squarish look, hence it's called a square wave. So nothing too scientific here. Let's switch over to the sawtooth. Again, playing the same note. A whole bunch of harmonics here as well. So all these four waveforms, when I play that same note, they sound different. And that is referred to as timbre. So the sine wave has no harmonics, hence it's a sine wave. A triangle shape specifically only has odd harmonics. Now when I say odd harmonics, think of all your harmonics to be numbered as odd and even. So this first one, I guess, could be the odd one. And that's the even, odd, even, odd, even, odd. So you can see the even ones are missing. And of course, they gradually get softer and softer. Switching over to a sawtooth, you'll notice that this one has the odd and even harmonics. First one, odd, second, even, third, odd, fourth, even, so on and so forth. So a sawtooth has odd and even harmonics, whereas a triangle only has the odd harmonics, and also you can see it gets softer much quickly. Back to the sawtooth. You can see all harmonics, and they're pretty consistent across the entire spectrum range there. Switching to a square wave. Now this too only has odd harmonics, but it's much louder than the triangle shape. See that there? Same set of harmonics, but much louder. So there is a close relationship between a triangle and a square. Alright, I spent a lot of time talking about these waveforms, so hopefully it's starting to make sense now. Now for a moment, we're just gonna switch over to this analog mode. Now in the analog domain, nothing is ever perfect. There's a lot of variance from theory. So let's check out the sine wave in this mode. You can see here that sine wave looks a bit bent, and of course there's some harmonics in there. and those harmonics are not quite... Let me play a G here and let's see what's going on here. Okay, so it looks kind of like a triangle shape. You can see it only has the odd harmonics. Switching over to the triangle. This is interesting. So the triangle shape has the odd harmonics, but a little bit of the even harmonics here as well. And you can see here this triangle shape has a bit of a fin-like shape to it. Switching over to the sawtooth. You can see that sawtooth shape is not so clean like the digital sawtooth. It's a very clear-cut sawtooth here. Whereas the analog one is a bit curved out and also a bit muffled. You can see the frequencies. It's almost as if we're filtering out some of those higher harmonics. Switching to the square. So that's our digital. Now that doesn't even look like a square shape. Let me play a lower note. Very different. Switching back to digital. That's a pure square shape. So that's basically what happens in the analog domain. And every device will react differently, especially when you're working with hardware devices. Alright, enough talk about waveforms and timbre. Hopefully it really makes sense now. In the next tutorial, we're going to look at some of the other parameters on the VCO. Alright, now that we understand the 4 different waveform outputs of the oscillator, let's look at some of the other controls. This giant dial over here is the frequency control. Now, we have frequency control from the keyboard because we can see here from our core MIDI, we have control voltage output going in to the 1 volt per octave input here, which means that for every volt we have 1 octave, or there are 12 notes within 1 octave. Now all this math calculation is done internally. We don't have to worry about it because we just have to play notes on our MIDI controller, and this module will convert it into control voltage and convert it into that 1 volt per octave range. So it tracks the oscillator perfectly. So when I play a C major scale on my keyboard, and we also have a physical control to change the pitch. So now if I was to just change it manually, we can make it really, really low where it just becomes just clicks. Or really, really high. Ouch, that hurts. Alright, so I'm going to right click this dial to set it back to the center position. Always important to leave that at the center position because think about this, when I'm playing the note C, okay, that sounds like a C right now because this is left in the center position. We're not offsetting the pitch, but let's say if I move this up a bit higher, if I play that same C note, it's no longer a C. So always important to leave that at the center position or tune it and just be aware that what is going to happen to the tuning of your oscillator. Unfortunately, we do not have indicators to show us where we're tuning it to. So for example, if I want to tune this down an octave or up an octave, I'll have to do it by ear, kind of like an actual analog device. Alright, so moving down over here, there's a fine tune control. Let's see what happens when I change that. So it looks like it moves up a minor third. So when I'm playing a C, that's a C there, it goes all the way up to an E flat. I'm right clicking to reset that back to the center. So it goes up a minor third and also goes down a minor third. So a fine tune control as opposed to a much more coarse control with this bigger dial. Alright, what else do we have here? There's pulse width control. This is a pretty interesting parameter. We'll take a look at this in a separate tutorial. Moving down here, we have FMCV. So FM stands for frequency modulation, control voltage. So we have an oscillator which produces a particular frequency, but we can modulate that frequency if we were to plug in a particular control voltage in here. And if we crank this up, that control voltage will modulate the pitch of the oscillator. Now, all this control voltage modulation stuff I'm going to leave for a separate tutorial. For now, let's just focus on everything else aside from modulation. So we'll get back to this later on. Same thing over here with pulse width modulation CV. So we have pulse width over here, and then there's pulse width modulation with this pulse width modulation input over here. Sync is another advanced control which we're going to talk about in a separate tutorial. So the main takeaway from this tutorial would be the pitch control. So we have this oscillator here. We have a main pitch control which works in semitones, and then you have a fine-tune control which works in cents and has a range of about a minor third. Alright, in the next tutorial, let's check out how this pulse width control works. Now in the previous tutorial, we checked out the 4 different basic analog waveform outputs from the oscillator. This 4th one here is called a square output, but actually it's part of a mother category called pulse waveforms. So let's talk about that now. So we still have the square wave output plugged into the VCA. So we're producing the square output in digital mode, so it's a pure square shape. Now the reason why this falls under the pulse category is because there is a pulse width control which can adjust the width of the square wave's pulse. So take a look at the scope here. So you notice how there's a positive part of the cycle and then there's a negative part of the cycle which repeats again and again to produce the tone. So that's the positive and that's the negative. And you will also notice that the positive and the negative are equal in terms of width. Right? Now, with the pulse width control, we can change that. So you notice how I made the positive part to be longer than the negative part. Even longer, even longer. And that's at its maximum. Right click to set it back to default. You can also go the other way. So I can make the positive thinner and the negative wider. Now the whole purpose of doing this is to produce new timbres. Now we have 4 basic waveforms, but let's say we want some more variety. We can take a square waveform, adjust its pulse width, and create a variety of different tones. So this sounds different from this, from this, and of course, the original square wave. Now fundamentally, one important thing to consider is that the square wave, as we have discovered, has only odd harmonics. But once you change that pulse width, this no longer is true. You can see I changed it just a wee bit and we're already introducing some other harmonics in there. Let's change it more. Some more even harmonics in there now. At this point, the even harmonics are louder and the odd harmonics are a bit softer. Same thing the other way. I'm a big fan of pulse waveforms. They sound very cool, has a very nasal-like quality to it. Alright, so that's pulse width. And as I mentioned, there is this pulse width modulation control voltage. We have a PWM input over here. We'll take a look at all this modulation stuff much later on. But that's essentially the oscillator, at least the basic parameters of it. In the next tutorial, let's introduce a filter. Alright, let's now talk about the voltage control filter. I've changed up the patch here. We have introduced the filter in this patch. So we have the oscillator, a filter, an amplifier, and that goes into the audio engine. We still have a MIDI device, and of course the scope and the spectrum analyzer to visualize the sound. Alright, so let's start patching things in. Let's take the sawtooth output and plug it into this filter. This filter has two outputs, one for the low pass filter and one for the high pass filter. Let's start with the low pass filter. It's the most commonly used filter in subtractive synthesis. I'll plug that in to the VCA. And let's take the output from the VCA and plug it into the input on the audio interface. I'll plug it into both. Take the gate output from the MIDI, plug it into the CV control on the VCA so the sound is muted, and now only if I play notes on my keyboard do we hear the sound. Pitch control from CV output of the MIDI device to 1 volt per octave on the oscillator, so I can play different notes. And now just so we can analyze the output, let's take the output out of the VCA, plug it in here on the scope, as well as on the spectrum analyzer. Alright, now we're ready to take a look at the filter. Now before I explain what happens, have a listen to what happens when I change this frequency dial as I play a note, and also keep an eye on the scope and the frequency analyzer. So right now we have no filtering, and as I bring this frequency dial down, so essentially what we're doing here is cutting out or removing those higher frequencies in the sound. And eventually you get to a point where you don't hear anything at all. Let me play a really low note. So as we increase this frequency dial, now we can slowly start to hear the tones in this sound. Slowly starting to shape into that sawtooth. Now it kind of has that sawtooth shape, but it's still kind of dull. And when the frequency dial is all the way at the highest, we hear the pure sawtooth tone. So that's essentially what a filter does, removes certain frequencies from a sound. Specifically, the low-pass filter removes high frequencies. So if I set the frequency in the center here, I'm cutting out a set of the high frequencies. If I set it down here, I'm cutting out more of those frequencies. And you'll notice the more frequencies you cut out, the more the waveform starts to look like a sine wave. Because as we already know, a sine wave just has the fundamental frequency and no upper harmonics. Alright, while we're here, let's also check out the high pass filter. So I'll switch this cable. So now the high pass filter is engaged. Now the high pass filter is the exact mirror image of a low pass filter. So I'll set the frequency all the way to the lowest value here. So now when I play a note, it's not really cutting out any frequencies, but as I increase this parameter, you can hear it starts to cut out those lower frequencies first and then gradually the upper frequencies. And when this is set to the highest, you have only the extreme high frequencies left in the sound. So that's the difference between the low pass filter and the high pass filter. Let's go back to the low pass filter. This is probably the more commonly used filter. Let's use this to check out some of the other parameters on the filter. There's a fine control. This is not common on filters, but we have one here, so let's just talk about it. Just like the oscillator that had a fine-tune control, there's a fine-tune control for this frequency dial, because technically this is also a frequency control. This is also set in hertz or kilohertz. So I guess it makes sense to have a fine-tune control. So let's have a listen to what this does. So right now my frequency is in the center in low-pass mode. So I'm cutting out quite a lot of frequencies. But if I increase this fine parameter, I'm going to just open it up just a little bit. If I move it down further, I'm going to cut out more frequencies. Pretty straightforward. Now another interesting parameter on a filter is resonance. So let's see how the resonance works. Let me set the frequency a bit higher here. Alright, so we can hear those upper frequencies being attenuated. Now let's introduce some resonance. Again, have a listen and also keep an eye on the scope and the spectrum analyzer to see what this does. Pretty interesting stuff. So one very obvious thing that happens is that we lose a lot of the overall signal, especially the low frequencies in the sound. So I'm playing this relatively low note here. As I increase the resonance, you notice we lose some of that bass response. But at the same time, we are accentuating that higher frequency, and we can see on the spectrum where that is. Right? It gets to a point where it starts to sound like feedback. And that particular point is just the frequency on the filter. Because if I change this, you can see that point moves. So I guess if you want to define the resonance, you can say it's the boost of frequencies at or around the filter frequency. And this really gives some character to the filter, a very important parameter on a filter. Alright, I'll bring it all the way down for now. Now frequency CV here is very similar to the FM CV on the oscillator, so we'll skip that for now. Drive is pretty straightforward. So again, let's have a listen to this. So you can hear it distorts the sound a bit. Changes up the wave shape and just gives the sound an overall interesting character. Now, one pretty interesting thing that happens with analog voltage controlled filters is that when that resonance is really high, especially when it's all the way at the highest, the filter itself starts to self-oscillate, which means it doesn't even need a signal to a filter. When I play a note on my keyboard now, you can hear a sine wave tone. And that tone is being produced by the filter itself. If I reduce the resonance, that tone goes away. If you want to change the tone, playing different notes on the keyboard will not change it. Because playing different notes on the keyboard right now is just changing the pitch on the oscillator. But it's not changing the pitch of this tone that's coming out of the filter. To change the pitch that's coming out of this filter, we have to change that cutoff frequency, because that's the frequency that's being accentuated right now. So the best way to actually play this is to take the CV out from our MIDI controller and plug it into the frequency input on the filter. Now I'm playing different notes on my keyboard and we're not hearing any change because this frequency CV dial is set in the center, which is 0 in the center. So let's crank it up to the maximum. So now when I play, that's a C major scale. It may not actually be starting from a C because the starting point is being defined by this frequency dial here. So if I set it here, if I play those same notes, so there you go. That's a little trick you can do with any analog style filter. Crank up the resonance and treat it like a sine wave generator. Now there's one more filter type I want to show you, and that's a bandpass filter. We don't need a separate module for this. We can actually create a bandpass filter by using a low-pass filter and a high-pass filter in series. Let me show you how that's done. I'm going to right-click, go into the fundamental category and load in another filter, VCF. I want to place this right next to the existing filter, so let's make some room. All right, perfect. Actually, wait a minute. This needs to go over here, and this needs to come in here. All right, now it's perfect. So to set two filters in series, we take the output of one filter, let's say in low-pass filter mode, and plug it into the input on the second filter, and then take the output of the next filter, let's say in high-pass mode, and plug it into the input on the VCA. So let's say we'll use a square wave output this time, plug it to the input on our first filter. It's going to get filtered, the high frequencies are going to be removed, and then that filtered sound is going to go into the high-pass filter, which is going to remove some low frequencies. That's going to go into the amplifier, and we're going to hear a bandpass filtered result. Let's have a listen to this. So the low-pass filter cuts out some of those higher frequencies, and the high-pass filter cuts out those lower frequencies. We can reduce the resonance on this because that's producing that self-oscillation. It's better. And let's increase the resonance on this. So that's a square wave oscillator going in through a bandpass filter that we've custom created here. Now technically there wasn't a square wave output because the pulse width is not in the center. So if I right click and set it to the center, now we have a perfect square wave. You'll notice it has a hollow tonality to it. That's how you can distinguish it from any kind of a pulse width version. Let's hear the sawtooth through this bandpass filter. Pretty interesting tone. How about the triangle wave? Now how about the sine wave? Now in this case, we are hearing upper harmonics because this filter is adding this drive here. Let's get rid of the drive. And now you'll notice that there's very little difference between this and a pure sine wave. In fact, when I'm playing some notes, we barely hear anything. That's because a sine wave doesn't have any upper harmonics, so there's nothing there to filter. The high-pass filter is filtering the sound, but then it's filtering out that fundamental frequency. That's why at some places, we just don't hear anything at all. So generally, when you're working with filters, you want to use harmonically rich sound sources. Triangle, sawtooth, square, or a sine wave with distortion. Alright, in the next tutorial, we'll check out the VCA section. Alright, let's now talk about the voltage-controlled amplifier, the VCA. We've been using it all this while. As the name suggests, it's an amplifier. It amplifies the signal, but that's not its main purpose. Its main purpose is to control a signal. So up to this point, I've tried my best to avoid any CV talk. So I'm saving that for later. But with the VCA, we can't really avoid it because, as I said, that's its main purpose, to control the signal that is passing through it. So right now we have this fancy bandpass filter signal going into the VCA's input here. And then there's the output, which goes out to the audio interface. So on the CV input here, we're controlling that signal, albeit in a very simplistic fashion. So we have this basic gate signal that is telling the VCA to go to its highest value when I play a note, and when I let go of a note, go back down to a lowest value. So to really visualize this, I'm going to disconnect this over here and connect the gate output to the X input here. Alright, so we get to see what the gate output looks like. So when I play a note, You see how it jumps up to this high value? It says 10 here, 10 volts. And then we have maximum volume. And as soon as I let go of the note, it jumps back down to 0 volt and the signal goes back down to 0. Let's see if I can scale this so you can actually see the movement there. Maybe the time parameter here. There we go. So when I hold down a note, you can see it stays at that high value as long as I'm holding down the note and the VCA is at its maximum. And if I let go, it comes back down to 0 volt and this goes all the way down to silence. So as I said, that's the main purpose of the VCA, to control the signal that is passing through it. Now there's a linear exponential switch here, which is not going to make sense yet because this only works when there is a gradual change of level. Right now the change is instantaneous, like an on-off switch. If there was a gradual change, that gradual change can be linear or exponential. We will get back to this later on when we look at some of the other more interesting modulators that we will use. But that's essentially the VCA. Now while we're here, let's also check out the other VCA. There's a VCA 2, which works pretty much exactly the same way as VCA over here. It basically has a level control here instead of the slider. Now this slider over here basically sets the highest value. So now when I play a note, it only goes up to this value. Even though it's receiving that same full 10 volt, it's limiting the volume to this position. You can bring it down further, and now the sound is softer. So it's basically scaling that control voltage signal. Same thing over here, you have that level control. Now instead of a switch to switch between linear and exponential mode, there are two separate inputs here. Of course, there's an audio input for the VCA to control and an audio output. The bottom section is identical, so this module basically has two VCAs in one. Alright, now that we have all the basic modules taken care of, now we understand them well, let's talk about all the fancy modulators, specifically the LFOs and the ADSR envelopes.